Cold came first. Not the kind that brushes your skin and makes you shiver. The kind that crawls into your bones and settles there, heavy and patient, like it knows you have nowhere to go. She felt it through the worn leather of her moccasins, through the threadbare blanket wrapped around her shoulders, through the hollow ache in her stomach that had been there so long, she had almost forgotten what fullness felt like. Her name was Ayana, though the missionaries who taught her English when she was 7 had tried to call her Grace. She never answered to it. Grace was a word for people who had choices. She had 3 children, a dead husband, and a language she wished she could forget. The snow had been falling for 2 days, not the soft kind that melts on your tongue, the kind that erases the world. It came down in sheets so thick you could not see your own hand stretched out in front of you, could not tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Somewhere behind her, through the white curtain of wind and ice, her people were scattered across these mountains, pushed farther and farther from the places where their grandmothers were buried, where the old songs still lived in the rocks and the water. Somewhere ahead, she did not know how far, was a temporary camp where they were supposed to wait for orders from officials who spoke only in numbers and deadlines and ultimatums. But her youngest, a boy of 4 winters named Takoda, had woken that morning burning with fever. His small body shook so violently she thought his bones might crack. His lips were cracked and colorless. She had no medicine, no clean water, no fire that would not blow out in this wind. Her daughter, Kiona, 10 winters old, carried what little cornmeal they had left in a leather pouch tied to her waist. Her son, Nashoba, 8 winters old, walked ahead with a stick he pretended was a weapon, though his eyes were scared and his legs shook from hunger and cold. They had been walking for 3 days trying to reach the others, but the storm had swallowed the trail. When she saw the figures moving through the snow, her first instinct was to hide. Her hand went to Takoda's mouth before he could cough, her body tensing like an animal that knows it has been cornered. The figures were blurred by distance and wind, but she could see the shapes of them. Long coats, wide-brimmed hats, the kind of people her husband had told her to run from, the kind of people who had been there the day he did not come home. She pressed her children against the rocks, her heart a drum inside her chest, her breath shallow and silent. But Takoda coughed. A wet, rattling sound that echoed too loud in the stillness between wind gusts, and the figures stopped, turned. One of them pointed. She could hear their voices now, muffled and urgent, speaking words she understood, but wished she did not. English. The language of treaties that were broken before the ink dried, the language of promises that turned to smoke. They were colonists, families. She could see that now as they came closer. A man in a heavy coat, his face red and chapped from cold. A woman clutching a bundle that moved and whimpered. 2 children, maybe 6 and 9, their eyes wide and frightened. An older man, limping, leaning on a younger one. They looked lost. They looked desperate. They looked, she realized with a shock that made her stomach turn, exactly like her own people had looked 3 days ago when the orders came to move again. The man in front raised his hand, not in threat, but in something that looked almost like pleading. He said something she could not hear over the wind. He gestured to the mountains, to the sky, to his own group. Then he saw her children, saw Takoda's fevered face, saw Kiona's hollow cheeks, saw Nashoba's stick, his small, defiant stance. The man's expression changed, not to anger, to something worse. Recognition. She wanted to run. Every part of her screamed to take her children and disappear into the white. But Takoda was too weak to walk. The storm was too strong. And the man was pointing now, not at her but past her, to a dark gap in the rocks behind them. A cave. She had not even seen it. He was shouting now, gesturing wildly, and she understood even through the wind. Shelter. He was telling her there was shelter. She did not move. Could not move. Her mind was a war. These people had names for her. Names she had heard soldiers use. Names that made her less than human. These people had taken everything. Land, rivers, the graves of her ancestors, her husband's life. And now this man was pointing at a cave, his face desperate, his own children shaking from cold behind him, and she realized with a horror that felt like falling that he was asking her permission. He was asking if they could share the shelter. Kiona tugged at her sleeve. Her daughter's voice was small and cracked. "Ina," she whispered. "Mother, Takoda needs to be warm." The girl's eyes were not on the colonists. They were on her baby brother, whose lips were turning blue, whose small chest rose and fell too quickly, too shallowly, and Ayana felt something inside her crack. Not break. Crack. Like ice that has been frozen too long and finally begins to give. She nodded. Once. Sharp. And turned toward the cave without looking at the colonists again. She heard them follow, heard their footsteps crunching in snow, heard the woman murmuring something soft to the bundle in her arms, heard the children's labored breathing. She did not look back. Could not. If she looked back, she might see them as people, and she could not afford that. Not yet. Not ever. The cave was shallow, but deep enough to block the wind. The ceiling was low and blackened from old fires. Someone had been here before, maybe her own people, maybe others. It did not matter. The colonists entered behind her, shaking snow from their coats, their breath coming out in clouds. The man who had pointed started gathering sticks and dry brush from the back of the cave, his hands shaking. The older limping man sat heavily against the wall, his face grey with pain. The woman with the bundle sank down and unwrapped it carefully. A baby, maybe 6 months old. Its cry was thin and high, like a bird. Ayana set Takoda down on the driest part of the ground and wrapped him tighter in the blanket. Kiona knelt beside him, her small hands rubbing his arms, trying to bring warmth back into him. Nashoba stood at the mouth of the cave, his stick still in his hand, his eyes locked on the colonist children who huddled near their mother. The two groups did not speak, did not look at each other directly. The silence was thick and sharp, broken only by the howl of wind and the crackle of fire as the man finally got the kindling to catch. The flames were small at first, hesitant as if they too were unsure whether to exist in this space, but they grew, and with them came a warmth that was almost painful after so much cold. Ayana felt her fingers begin to thaw, felt the ache in her feet intensify before it eased. She glanced at the colonists across the fire. The man was blowing on the flames, coaxing them higher. The woman was trying to nurse the baby, but her hands were shaking too hard. The older man's eyes were closed, his breathing ragged. The two children stared into the fire with expressions too old for their faces. No one spoke. The wind outside screamed like something dying. Inside, there was only the sound of breath and fire and the small involuntary noises of bodies trying to stay alive. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time felt strange here, stretched and compressed all at once. Takoda's fever did not break, but his shaking eased slightly in the warmth. The baby stopped crying and fell into a fitful sleep against its mother's chest. The older colonist man began to cough, deep and wet, and did not stop for a long time. It was Kiona who moved first. She reached into the leather pouch at her waist and pulled out a small handful of cornmeal. It was all they had left, maybe enough for one thin soup if they stretched it with snowmelt. She looked at her mother, her dark eyes serious and questioning. Ayana felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say no, wanted to tell her daughter to put it away, to save it, that they owed these people nothing. But Kiona was already moving, her small feet padding across the cave floor, her hand extended toward the colonist children. The two children stared at the cornmeal in Kiona's palm like it was something impossible. The older one, a girl with tangled blonde hair, looked up at her mother. The woman's face was a mask of shock and something that looked like shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Kiona waited, her hand still extended, her expression patient and solemn. Finally, the colonist boy, younger than his sister, reached out and took a small pinch of the meal. His fingers brushed Kiona's palm. He whispered something that sounded like thank you but was barely audible. The girl took some too. Then, hesitantly, carefully, she reached into her own pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small piece of hardtack bread, dry and cracked but still food. She broke it in half and offered one piece to Kiona. The two girls looked at each other for a long moment, their hands suspended between them. holding pieces of sustenance that neither could afford to give away but both were offering anyway. Ayana felt something inside her chest collapse. Not break, collapse. Like a structure that has been holding too much weight for too long and finally gives in. She watched her daughter take the bread, watched the colonist girl take the cornmeal, watched them both return to their sides of the fire. Neither smiled, neither spoke. But something had shifted, something small and terrifying and irreversible. The man across the fire was staring at Ayana now. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, but there was something in them that made her look away. Not anger. Not pity. Something worse, recognition. He saw her, not as a threat, not as a problem to be solved or removed, as a mother, as someone trying to keep children alive in a storm, as someone exactly like him. She hated him for it. Night came, though it was hard to tell in the cave where darkness had always been. The fire burned lower. The wind outside grew colder. Bodies huddled closer to the flames, careful not to touch, careful to maintain the invisible line that divided the cave into two territories. But the cold did not care about lines. It pressed in from all sides, indifferent and patient. The woman with the baby began to hum. It was barely a sound, just a vibration in her throat. But Ayana recognized it. A lullaby. Different words, different melody, but the same purpose. The same ancient instinct to soothe a child in the dark. Without thinking, without deciding, Ayana found herself humming too. A song her own mother had sung to her. A song in a language the colonists could not understand, but somehow, in this moment, did not need to. The two songs did not harmonize. They were too different, born from too many miles and too many years of separation, but they existed together in the small space of the cave, rising and falling like breath, like the crackle of fire, like the wind that could not reach them here. Takoda's fever broke sometime in the deepest part of night. His small body relaxed, his breathing evened out, and he fell into a real sleep for the first time in days. Ayana felt tears on her face before she realized she was crying. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed to show weakness, ashamed to feel relief in the presence of people she was supposed to hate. Across the fire, the older colonist man's coughing worsened. The younger man who had been helping him pulled out a small tin from his pack, medicine maybe, or something like it. He mixed it with water from a canteen and held it to the old man's lips. The old man drank, grimaced, coughed again. The younger man's hands were gentle, patient. It was the same way Ayana had held water to Takoda's lips an hour before. She looked away. Morning came grey and muted. The storm had not ended, but it had eased. The wind was no longer screaming, just whispering. The snow still fell, but softer now, more like a blanket than a weapon. The fire had burned down to embers. Bodies stirred slowly, stiff and aching from a night on cold stone. The man who had pointed to the cave was the first to stand. He stretched, winced, and walked to the mouth of the cave to look out at the world. He stood there for a long time, his silhouette framed against the pale light. Then he turned back, his eyes finding Ayana's. He said something in English, slow and clear. "Thank you." She did not respond, did not know how to. The words felt too small for what had happened here, too inadequate for the weight of what they had shared. He seemed to understand. He nodded once, a sharp, respectful gesture, and turned back to his family. They began to gather their things. The woman wrapped the baby carefully. The children moved slowly, reluctantly, their eyes drifting to Kiona and Nashoba one last time. The older man could not stand on his own. The younger one helped him up, supported his weight. They moved toward the mouth of the cave, toward the white world waiting outside. At the entrance, the man paused. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He set it on a rock near the opening, looked back at Ayana one more time, and then stepped out into the snow. She waited until they were gone, until their shapes had blurred and disappeared into the white. Then she walked to the rock and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was flour, not much, maybe enough for a few meals, and beneath it a small wooden carving. A horse, roughly made, probably by one of the children. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the grooves and curves. Kiona came to stand beside her. "Why did they leave this, Ina?" Her voice was soft, confused. Ayana did not have an answer, not one that made sense, not one that fit with everything she had been taught, everything she had believed. "I do not know," she said finally. And it was the truth. They stayed in the cave until Takoda was strong enough to walk. 2 more days. The storm passed. The world outside became navigable again. They packed what little they had and prepared to leave. Before they did, Ayana built the fire up one more time. Not because they needed it, because someone else might. Someone lost in the next storm. Someone who needed shelter. She left the wooden horse on a rock where it could be seen. She did not know why. Just that it felt necessary. As they walked through the snow toward the distant camp where her people waited, Kiona walked beside her. Neshoba carried Takoda on his back, the boy's thin arms wrapped around his brother's neck. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold, but Ayana kept thinking about the cave, about the fire, about the way the colonist children's eyes had looked exactly like Kiona's, hungry, scared, hopeful despite everything. She thought about the flour they would use tonight to make soup, about the wooden horse heavy in her pocket, about the sound of 2 different lullabies rising together in the dark. She had spent her whole life learning who the enemy was, learning what they had taken, what they would take, what they represented. And in 3 days, in a cave during a storm, children who did not know they were supposed to hate each other had shared food, had seen each other, had chosen, without language or ideology or history, to be kind. It changed nothing. Her husband was still gone. Her people were still displaced. The orders would still come. The land would still shrink. The soldiers would still arrive with maps and deadlines. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. When they reached the camp, no one asked where they had been. No one asked about the flour or the carved horse. People were too tired, too hungry, too focused on survival to notice small things. But that night when Kiona asked if she could keep the wooden horse, Ayana said yes. And when Takoda asked why the colonist children had shared food, she did not have an answer that fit the old stories. Because they were children, she said finally, and children do not always know what they are supposed to hate. Months later, when spring came and the camps moved again, Ayana would see colonist wagons on distant trails. She would feel the old fear, the old anger. But beneath it, something else had taken root. Something small and stubborn and impossible to ignore. A question that would not leave her alone. What if the stories were not the whole truth? What if the people she had been taught to fear carried the same fears, fed their children the same way, sang them to sleep with the same gentleness? What if the line between them was thinner than anyone wanted to admit? She did not have answers, only the memory of a cave, a fire, 2 little girls sharing food they could not afford to give away, and the weight of a wooden horse in her pocket that she carried everywhere, even though she could not explain why. Some encounters do not change the world. They just change the person who experienced them. And sometimes that is enough. Not to fix anything. Not to make anything fair. Just to plant a seed of doubt in certainty. To make you wonder, late at night when everyone else is asleep, if the person you were taught to fear might be more like you than you ever imagined. And once you wonder that, once that question takes root, you can never fully go back to who you were before. The old stories still exist. The old anger still burns. But beside them, something else has begun to grow. Something fragile and uncertain and deeply, quietly human. The world did not change that day in the cave, but Ayana did. And perhaps that is how all change begins, not with armies or treaties or declarations, but with small moments of unexpected grace. With children who do not yet know they are enemies. With mothers who recognize each other across a fire, with the simple, radical act of sharing food in a storm. If stories like this one touch something in you, if they remind you that beneath all our differences we share the same basic needs, the same fears, the same capacity for kindness, consider staying with us. These fragile moments of connection are easy to forget in a world that prefers simple narratives. But they happened. They still happen. and they matter more than we know.